Good evening, today we have another episode of Should You Talisman. This series obviously started a couple of weeks ago, and I got quite a bit of feedback, but most of it was that you all enjoyed the video, and you all enjoyed the layout. Some of you did mention about the length of the video, but I just want to quickly address that before we begin. Main reason for that is because obviously there's a lot of things to cover in this, and that's why the timestamps are there, so if you want to just skip some parts, that is the option there. But of course, this is meant to be an in-depth series that covers it to really explain the vehicles in the Talisman series, and of course, explain if you should put a talisman on them or not, I should say. So, we now move on to the P-26 B-35, and starting us off traditionally with the weaponry. Now, of course, compared to the last P-26, we unfortunately take a downgrade. And no prizes to guess what the conclusion is going to be at the end, but, you know, it's pretty simple to work out. So starting us off in terms of armament, we have twin 30 caliber machine guns. You'll obviously remember in the last episode, we had a 50 cal in the right hand side of the cowling, and a 30 cal in the left hand side of the cowling. But in the B-35, we have two 30 cals, which is not exactly stellar at this BR. Now, of course, unlike the last pea-shooter, I'm not going to recommend running stealth in the pea-shooter. I would arguably run omnipurpose, aka universal. This is because having twin 30s, even with stealth, doesn't make the damage output any better, to be brutally honest. And personally speaking, I would rather run something where I can at least get more shots on target, rather than not guarantee my shots on and get close and then you have to dogfight and the P-26 will lose that, etc, etc. And besides, the universal belt is pretty good on its own, but the twin 30s are not exactly adequate, and they're some of the lowest damage output in the game. Same with the Kai 10's 7.7s and the French 7.5s. But at least for the 7.5s on the French reserve planes, you get 4 of those, which is pretty good. And of course, same as with the other pea-shooter that we've already described in this series, you get 2 100-pound bombs. They have the same stats, which are 24.5 kilograms of TNT equivalent of explosive, 65mm of max armor penetration, 7 feet radius of destruction of armored vehicles, and the fragments go to 221. Pretty simple, and, well, we've already covered these bombs before, these A&M 30A1s. They're pretty simple to work out, and as I've demonstrated before, these aren't stellar in terms of bomb load, but the fact that you get bombs on your reserve plane can also really benefit you in the long run. So don't expect the pea-shooters to be the worst reserves, because I don't think they are. Like, they're not the greatest. But the problem is with reserves is that they don't tend to be amazing anyway, so you can't really call them the worst. And technically speaking, the S199 is a reserve, and I'd argue that's worse than the pea-shooters, but at least that gets 20mm, but that's an entirely different subject. But that pretty much covers the weaponry. Of course, this thing doesn't really have much in the way of weaponry, like it's 230 cals and a couple of bombs. It's a lot quicker to cover than the one featured beforehand. And now we'll move on to the test flight to take a look at the aircraft's handling, performance, and just overall what it can do. See you in a moment. And welcome to the test flight. As you all know from the last episode, this is where we take a look at the aircraft's handling, how it does in terms of its weaponry and its versatility, if it has any secondary weapons of course, and just overall how the aircraft feels. So, unlike the pea-shooter in the last episode, this one doesn't get wep. And as you'll notice, it's not exactly getting off the ground the quickest. Whilst it does obviously not get wep, it's only losing about 60 horsepower. But if you look at the acceleration and compare it to the last episode, you will notice a bit of a difference. Whilst its acceleration is still pretty okay, the fact that it just can't get up to speed as quickly is, you know, not as good. And you can tell by the overall speed. that it's just not as good as the other pea shooters. Well, the other pea shooter that we mentioned in this series, the A-33, has the same problem as this thing. But this one does keep the landing flaps, which we featured in the last episode, of course. But these come down a little bit quicker, because this is a later model, so it does have a faster landing flap coming down, but it's not that much faster, is all I'll say. But of course, the guns can take out light trucks with little issue. But when it comes to taking out anything remotely armoured, that's where your bombs will come in. And the handling is exactly the same as the other pea shooter. But of course, when it comes to anything remotely armoured, you're going to need them. And of course, same as the other pea shooters, well, the other pea shooter featured in this series, I should say, the bombs are the same and they drop at the same rate, as in they drop it as a pair. But like, the handling and everything is exactly the same, and obviously with the landing flaps, which we're going to demonstrate the landing again, just to reiterate my point. The fact that this aircraft still just doesn't bring anything to the table over the M2 just makes it a much worse option. Having that 50 cal and 60 extra horsepower is just what's really going to make this thing lose out. And of course, the aircraft bounces regardless, but as we all know, I'm not even going to touch the brakes here. Because we came in at a lower speed this time, we're not flipping over. But of course, I'm not touching the brakes, which is also what is contributing to this. Now, of course, this is the test flight map itself. This isn't the plane doing that, but even with a slight dab of brakes, you can sometimes get this thing to a safe stop. But if you leave the brakes on too much, you do that. So yeah, not exactly stellar, but you know, we landed it better than the other pea shooter, I guess. So that's at least a positive. But overall, why would you talisman this in terms of its handling and performance and firepower when the other pea shooter does it better? I'm a bit confused about this one, but hey ho, Gaijin gave me the talisman for this thing, I can't exactly argue. Anyway, let's go back to the hangar and let's discuss the competition of this aircraft, and ironically we're going to have to discuss the previous pea shooter. I'll see you in a moment. And welcome back to the hangar. Once again, this is going to be a pretty short section because obviously we covered the pea shooters in the last episode. So this will be something that just kind of nails the hammer in, so to speak. And yeah. The reason why I'm bringing up the pea shooter again from the last episode is the simple fact that it's just better than this one. So if you really wanted to talisman like a reserve aircraft on this BR, you'd pick this one night and day just because of its power and its 50 cal. The thing is that the B-35 literally brings nothing extra to the table. It's slower than the other pea shooter. That's talismaned in this series. It's got worse guns, it has the same bombs, it has the same flight performance, except it's slower at accelerating, its overall top speed is also relatively lower. Do I need to carry on? Like, I just literally do not see a point to this plane. And if you really want to talisman a reserve, here you go, here's your option. But same as the other pea shooter though, there are better options outside of reserves for this. Of course, I've already mentioned the F3F in the previous episode. This is an aircraft that is absolutely brilliant and is exactly the same as the P-36 pretty much, the P-36A, except it's a lot more agile, it does carry bombs, it just trades a bit of speed for it. And to be brutally honest, the F3F is fast enough for a biplane, so I really can't complain at that. And, well, I've already mentioned how good this plane is, and if you've watched my updated premium review of Gala's F3F, you know exactly what this aircraft can do in good hands. Same as before, the P-36A would also be a good candidate, the P-36C would also be a good candidate. The only candidates in this sort of BR that I would not recommend, in terms of fighters, is the F2A1, the F2A3, and the P-36G. The reason why I say this is because not only do these vehicles have a battle rating equivalent to rank 2 aircraft, so you'd just be better off putting a Talisman on these, they're just a bit too high BR and they don't grind too much that really constitute the expensive Talismans that these can offer. Because if we look at the F2A1, they're 300. The F2A3 I believe is 400 something, and the same with the P-36G. And the thing is if we go to the P-40E1, you're only paying about 100 GE more for a Talisman, and this is a better aircraft just overall anyway. Whilst the Buffaloes and the P-36 do have better handling overall than the P-40, the P-40 brings a lot more to the table with 650 caliber guns, decent low altitude performance, and its overall decent bomb load and everything. But we're not going to talk about the P-40 anymore. In terms of talismaning a bomber, there is obviously a few options. The SBD, which I forgot to mention in the last episode because I was a muppet. The SB2U3, another cracking choice for a talisman at this sort of BR. And of course the TBD-1 Devastator. If you really want to meme around, you could also go for the PBY-5. Not the 5A. Just the regular 5, so you don't get the landing gear, which, to be fair, if you're landing this thing with the landing gear, you've already got a problem itself. Just land it on the bloody float. But yeah, that pretty much concludes the P-26 B-35. And as I always say, in conclusion, this aircraft is absolutely not advised for a talisman, and it's so bad in fact, I would rather talisman the A34M2, because then at least I get a 50 cal and a bit more horsepower. And when you're literally clutching at straws trying to say, yes, this is better, and I've already said in the previous episode that it wasn't as good as what people probably think in terms of a talisman, yeah, that's when you know something really shouldn't be talismaned. But that's my overall conclusion for the P-26 B-35. I did say this would be a shorter episode because obviously this aircraft has less to cover, and of course we've covered most of the vehicle itself in the actual previous episode itself. So yeah, that pretty much concludes the B-35. I hope you enjoyed it regardless though. Obviously next up in the series will be the SB2U2 because we are doing it in terms of how it's presented here. But this one should at least be a little bit more interesting to some extent because we have a lot more to cover in terms of bomb load, but of course we have a few other things to consider, like the bomb trapeze, but we'll come to that when it comes to this thing's video. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video on the P-26 B-35 as part of the Should You Talisman series. Short answer, no, if you've just pretty much skipped to this point. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it for today, and I will see you all on the next one.